Hello, everyone. Dr. Shelley here at the Shareable Wave. And as you can see, who's sitting across from me, Dan Winter, is so highly regarded for his contributions across such a vast range of specialties that I really seldom even say too much about his background anymore. However, because today's conversation is directed specifically to trauma-informed care, I did want to add emphasis to Dan's insights and background regarding or relating sacred geometry and mathematical modeling to psychophysiology. And I don't know if I have this right, but I interpret that to mean consciousness expressing coherent self-awareness. So it's all about heart and getting coherent. And there are few with a bigger heart than Dan Winter. So Dan, thank you so much for joining us and welcome.
Well, thank you, Shelley. The psychophysiology word actually means that in graduate school, I was building polygraphs, and we were doing biofeedback to help people with hypertension and high blood pressure and stress management. And that has evolved today into our 6 or more biofeedback apps like flameinmind.com and iThrive and heart rate variability and all that stuff. So that's the connection. And ultimately that points to the physics of consciousness, which is kind of why we're here.
That's exactly why we're here. And I'm sure we'll have lots of opportunity to expand on some of those technologies that you've developed, in particular, how they relate to teaching access to bliss. But we all know and have experienced how traumatic injury just shocks and changes all systems from personal to global and beyond. And that bliss might be, I always say it's the fastest way to healing, fastest way to wellness. But wouldn't it be just so handy if we had a map we could carry for the first few times, that people set out in search of this bliss? So for our listeners, Dan's theories in coherent emotion, not to mention his development of all those various, very accessible, very affordable technologies, offer not just your ordinary map to bliss, but virtually do so, as that highlight satellite imagery, 360-degree panoramic, we're getting the best of the best here. And route planning, kind of a zoom on what is that? Google Earth, it's Zoom Earth or something like that. So the map we have today is going to be very appreciated, and in particular bringing awareness for the trauma informed workers, the therapists and so on. So Dan, do you feel like we should maybe begin with an overview of how bliss opens access to resolve trauma? Even addictive based traumas.
Well, as you know, I do have a lot of background in addiction therapies, particularly biofeedback solutions to addiction. My teacher there was the famous Martin Wuttke in California, who himself solved his heroin issues with brainwave biofeedback. And, the story there we've told many times. On the day that the alcoholic, for example, learns to make alpha in their brainwave, which is the beginnings of bliss, that's the day when the next drink of beer will not taste good. That's the famous, and the meaning was simple, that addiction, for example, alcoholism, or by implication drugs, was a wrong turn on the right road, as we often say, to bliss. And basically, the body and your teenagers are all willing to risk life or death in order to have some form of bliss, and rightfully so, because they know their immune system and immortality depends on accessing some form of bliss. And so the alcohol, or the addiction, alcohol in particular, mimics the bliss experience by, in this case, reducing the oxygen in the brain, which increases the conductivity, decreasing inhibition, and increasing alpha. So in effect, since alpha we know is basically the Schumann harmonic and the beginning of the cascade of harmonic that implodes phase conjugates and causes bliss, the charge implosion. And so when you use some simple biofeedback, and we're getting better and better at that with flameandmind.com, to teach people to make their first alpha, when they can make alpha inside themselves, that's the day they don't want their next drink of beer. Actually, that's the famous story. And we actually know why, and we've told this many times, is that, I did tests for many years doing brainwave biofeedback where people who could make alpha, you ask them the question, when you close your eyes, do you see light or dark? The people who can make alpha say yes, and the people who cannot make alpha in their brainwaves say they see dark. So it's actually quite simple. By learning to make alpha, it turns the lights on. And now we even know what the light is. The light is the charge implosion that we call bliss, which is actually a cascade from alpha to beta, which starts the caduceus and conjugates, etc. So it all really fits together. Now, not to digress, but what we've been working on so much lately, and what is on my mind today, actually, is the group of children we started working with in Amsterdam with Iris, called the Outer Vision Project. flameandmind.com/outer vision. You can see the whole story. And basically, these are the kids who famously can see without their eyes. And we have dozens of films working with them, and they're completely blindfolded, and they're working with blocks and coloring, which obviously they're seeing clearly without their eyes. And this is a global famous phenomena. It's not even rare, actually. And so, Korotkov pioneered, he found golden ratio in the brainwaves of kids who could see with their eyes. And we have expanded that program and actually updated several times and improved flameandmind.com to now see alpha better, see gamma better, and see that cascade better, and to show the curves of the brainwaves. And we could show some of those pictures, but it's all at that link, flameandmind.com/outer vision. Anyway, so we're now, that project is successful. We're successfully able to see that harmonic cascade in the brainwave of kids who can see without their eyes. And Korotkov started doing that years ago, but our app, really evolved that. But now we're expanding that. Valerie's friend, Lady Denise, was telling us about how she sees elementals by closing her eyes. And these kids say it's like seeing through a tube, a vortex, and indeed how you see elementals, etc. So now the kids are going to visit Denise in Germany to see if the trance state they use to see without their eyes enables seeing elementals. And Denise draws a picture. It's very cool. And we believe that there's evidence even that this enables telepathy. And there's so much going on because we took brainwave cascades of people who have bliss, golden ratio, and EEG cascades, telepathy, octave cascades. Patrick says the kids who can see without their eyes have both a golden ratio and an octave cascade in the harmonics of their EEG going from alpha through gamma. At any rate, so the last thing I'm going to say, and this is why I'm a bit excited, but our wonderful friend Myra from Athens and Paris is currently doing a documentary with us, because when she started using Therify with those same harmonics, she started having incredible lucid dreaming and telepathy experiences, which triggered all kinds of things in her life. And we're going to have a new Therify blog all about these things, about how these harmonics trigger that still point. And not to carry on, but we're actually preparing a documentary. This is why this is all stuck in my head at the moment. I just need to share it. So we get the guy on video last night who teaches, I should remember his name, but he's quite famous, and he teaches how to lucid dream. And he's there saying, yes, better in lucid dreaming to do the meditation because you create a still point, and the still point is the leverage that enables you to steer when you're lucid dreaming, like the tornado, the vortex, the whole thing, which obviously is the phase conjugate charge implosive point that things like brain harmonics and the Therify make. That's how you fabricate the still point that gives you leverage to steer the tornado and the dream. So putting all these things together, well, first of all, the documentary is going to explain that the conjugate cascade, imploding charge toward bliss, embeds what's called longitudinal waves, which are these coherent compressional waves that spread out in a fractal like a rose and have leverage points, what they call dreaming tracks, and why the Earth grid is dodeca, and why at the gravity nodes of those cross points, the critical mass for nuclear reactions has actually changed because that's a compressional wave. And that longitudinal coherence, the ba from the ka, is the collective unconscious and the media of lucid dreaming and where you go when you die and all these things. So that's what the new documentary is going to be about. And we have lovely stories from Myra. It's really a fun thing we're putting together. Point being, now back to you and your question for the evening, now that I've emptied my full head with all these stories we're playing with, is so now you have trauma. Trauma is massive cellular pain, basically. And pain, obviously, we've defined it pretty well. Pain is fractality that's broken that then bleeds out charge due to lack of compression, literally. That's why the first thing you do with pain, you compress. And we know with Therify, in fact, I cut my toe 2 days ago, and within minutes in the Therify, the pain was dramatically reduced. And it's very famous for that. And so restored compression is the opposite of pain. So now, supposing you have massive cellular pain and you need to access that to restore the memory that's broken, you need to restore implosive compression, hence charge implosion bliss and finding that still point. So that's where this conversation might go.
That's where I was hoping we could take it, and I'm going to help our listeners who might be unfamiliar by asking you kind of some specific questions to help break it down. But, you know, out of all that you said there, number one, I'd love to know the name so we can watch for the name for the documentary being released. Number two, you mentioned the Schumann, and I don't know if you look at those kind of graphs, but we see so many whited out charts in the recent, say, past month or something. Does that represent or reflect kind of humanity's, the noosphere, the thought, you know, kind of layers? And then what else? I had one more thing. But anyways, go ahead with those two.
Well, that's great. I love you bringing up the noosphere, actually, or the omega point.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, the noosphere omega point is precisely where the charge harmonics conjugate precisely tuned to Planck, which is the only real 0-point omega point. And from that point of perfected compression, by exact harmonics golden ratio to Planck, you've embedded the projection from the transverse to the compressional longitudinal, creating that compressional array that can travel faster than light and do action at a distance. That's physics. That's what longitudinal interferometry is. And that's what the lucid dreaming is and almost all spiritual experience. So that rose-like fractal grid that only longitudinal array can create, dodecastellations, that becomes the media of what was called noosphere. And from there, you get access to that memory. And the only reason way you can turn on that radio is to initiate that perfect compression that enables you to modulate that perfect compression at the omega point, the noosphere. And
Okay. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
what was the first thing though? You said
I wanted to know the name of the documentary so we could watch for
actually,
it.
this will be two things. This new release will be two things. It will be the next Therify blog. So therify.net, the next release blog, which is not out yet, will be this new film and this new in-depth report from Maya, who I just spoke to. It will include her pictures. So she used Therify extensively with her mother at her center in Athens and then works in Paris. And she's kind of a wonderful psychologist. And she had amazing lucid dreaming and telepathy experiences that were clearly triggered by. Obviously, she had some inclination, but her stories are just incredible. It's really fun. But such a personal, deep example of you get to find the still point. And you can do that sequence of compressions with your own Bliss. Therify can help, or you can use Therify. But once you really reach that still point effectively, a near-death experience is another example, actually. Then that switches on that what we call DNA radio, access to that longitudinal interferometry. So that new release will be both the next Therify blog, and it will be the top of the incomplete article, flameinmind.com/outer vision, which is this, so the children see without their eyes. So that release will be in both of those places. And then,
Okay, I remembered.
Go ahead.
Speaking of outer vision.
Yes.
So, you know, what's really interesting is through use of the Therapy or coming to the still point, which some people might want to do the cheat sheet by going to your website that had Sarah's 7 arrows on it when you did that call with her. If you want to mention that, and then I'll come back to my topic.
Well, thank you. Well, 7arrows.net, and that's spelled out SEVEN, 7arrows.net. We were working with Sarah, who had a wonderful shaman in South America, who was using the visualization of the sequence of layers of 7 arrows, where you access this DNA radio and therefore the collective unconscious and therefore shamanic memory. Now, the point I'd like to make about that here in the context of electrical engineering is, look, those same 7 arrows are the symmetry arrows that exactly pass through the 7 symmetry axes of the tetrahedron. And that is the exact index of the muscle layers around your heart for a very important reason, because you couldn't get a better squeeze, is the famous ad for a tomato juicer. And the reason is because the symmetry index of all compressions need to be completed. Now, in the new documentary, this will be explained in more detail, but the intro is simple. We were trying to fix a problem that a lot of these new age woo-woos say, well, you know, like the Pleiadians, for example, they say, well, we're 5D and you're only 3D and we're in the next dimension and you ain't there and sorry about that and bye, kids. And everyone who wants more than 5th grade science knows they need something more than a Pleiadian saying, well, you ain't 5D yet, so you're not important. Well, sorry, you know, we'd like science. Well, here's the science. Okay, the science is really very simple. That if you visualize the metaphor, that tetracube is what you call 3D, and you have 7 axes of spin, and that achieves a certain completeness of compression. However, to add the next harmonic, exactly what needs to happen in your brain waves when you go from alpha, beta, theta to make it golden ratio, instead of superposing the next harmonics in an octave, the next spin that enables another axis of symmetry to be added to a cube can never be anything else other than golden mean ratio, which is another way of saying the only way you can get another axis of spin onto a cube is tilt it 32 degrees, blink 5 times, rotate, and you have a pentodeca, and the ratio of the edge of that cube to that dodeca is exactly golden ratio. So golden ratio is the only way you can go to the next dimension, literally, which means it's the only way you can add the next axis of spin symmetry, which means the only way you can add the next harmonic of compression, which means the only way you can implode your brain waves, because any other ratio would be destructive wave interference. So when we say we went to the next dimension, density, and therefore dimension, what we mean is we added the next axis of possible spin symmetry of charge, adding more compression. A practical example, the first time the planet discovered how to make a nuke, they called it implosion because they had to get compression perfect. Why? Critical mass was literally the critical amount of compression to access the inertia within that level of spin density. Well, the same thing applies to what's happening at the Planck threshold, where DNA radio and the collective unconscious and the dream spell lives. And to get to that compression, you need to create that implosion. And the only way you do it in your brain waves is to use both octaves and golden ratio. So when your brain waves make the next golden ratio of harmonic from alpha to theta and to gamma, you're literally going to the next dimension of spin symmetry, and therefore that implosion is what makes your body coherent in that longitudinal array, and that is the only meaning of being 5D. So specifically an electrical definition of you being 5D, just like those Pleiadians who are bragging all the time but don't really know what it is, means you can lucid dream, you can access a dream spell, and you can take memory through death because you're longitudinal phase coherent, what the Egyptians called the Ba from the Ka. So anyway.
That is fantastic, and you just like jumped way ahead to where I wanted to go, but in such a beautiful way. So thank you. I did want to maybe talk a little bit more about how the 7 muscles of your heart, the 7 muscles outside and the 5 inside, respond to every thought and emotion that you have. So by deliberately choosing specific thoughts, we can help to nudge our way back to coherence. And is that something that you think would be useful? And also maybe even unpacking a bit of how the human heart and hydrogen and say the heart of the sun, Anu, are the fractals that you're talking about.
Well, all those pictures are beautifully at sevenarrows.net. Thank you. And you're right, we should mention. So that Anu shape, that perfect slip knot, which is 5 spins inside, 7 spins outside. And we can dig at the pictures here, but it's so easy. Just go to sevenarrows.net. And
Mm-hmm.
so that is a perfect slip knot. And that was the shape seen by the first clairvoyants, Leadbeater and Besant, when they wrote Occult Chemistry and said, oh, we looked at the heart of hydrogen and we saw this perfect slip knot called Anu. And later they said, oh, we looked at the heart of the sun and we saw the same thing. And now we say, we look at the heart of the human and we see the same thing. So the heart of the human, the heart of the sun, and the heart of hydrogen, when the clairvoyants looked, they saw this same slip knot. It's uh, uh, 7 spins outside, which is how the heart muscle is layered, 7 arrows, the tetra, and 5 whorls inside. Now, for decades, theosophists have been agonizing because it was later shown that those same clairvoyants, Leadbeater and Besant, occult chemistry, in fact, accurately predicted the geometry of subatomic particles before they were known by current subatomic physics, and that was proven in Phillips' book, famous Psi Perception of Quarks. You can look it up, it's on the site. So these clairvoyants saw subatomic structure before physics knew about it, and they were right, and it was all about 5 spins and 7 spins nested inside. Well, now we know exactly what that means. 7 spins refers to the tetracubic lattice structure,
Mm-hmm.
and 5 spins refers to the dodecacosa lattice structure. And when you put one inside the other, what do you get? Perfect turning inside out, the perfect slip knot, the heart of the human, the heart of the sun. And if you take the spiral of on the donut, which is all these vortex are donuts, of those 7 arrows, and look at that spiral on that donut from the shadow of the 7 arrows, the tetra, you have the Hebrew alphabet. And I wrote the equation and did the first computer animation, which we call the alphabet of the heart. And those shadows are actually the vectors by which you would implode and therefore create gravity and steer plasma, which is the physics of how you steer when you are only a plasma cloud. For example, when you die, when you dream, and when you're an interstellar angelic plasma being. So the physics of the origin of Hebrew and the human heart muscle being those 7 arrows is actually the physics of the only way you have to steer when you are a plasma cloud. And guess what? That's what you're going to be when you're dreaming and when you're dead. So it's good to practice.
It's very good to practice, and it's so much fun too. Speaking of the clairvoyance, though, would that answer another question I had earlier when you were talking about the children being able to see without the use of their physical eyes? But now, in my experience, it's pretty easy to see elementals and things of those subtle worlds. But how about the people I've heard about, for instance, that can drive a car that are blind? I mean, actually blind, and they're able to see this kind of beta experience.
Well, I mean, I was watching the kids pretty carefully when they were seeing without their eyes. And when they first learned, they said it was like looking through a straw. And that, and we know their brain waves make a cascade. And so you're literally making a vortex of implosion. And then you're learning how to look through the center of that vortex like a tube. Now,
Mm-hmm.
what's making that vortex is literally the implosion of your brain harmonics, which is a charged tornado, charged donut, and training yourself to stay in that state where you hold that response to compression, and that's what it is, gives you leverage on the tornado. Remember, Bill Tiller proved focused human attention causes electric fields to compress. And we were the first ones to say, what is the physics of consciousness? Because we're the first ones to answer the question, why focused human attention causes electric fields to compress. We're the first ones to know why. And now that we know, you can teach people to that inner vision. It's funny, we called it outer vision, but it all depends on whether you're inside out or outside in.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and so when we're thinking of arriving at that shareable wave or the still point, and well, the time apertures, we'll come to time, but where I was going with that, are you familiar with the Emerald Tablets and Tanis Cuerda, Chiatal, and Goyana Huertas and Beda Ardal? Are those the seven layers that we're thinking of in terms of being a match to those time apertures that Sarah referenced?
Well, a couple things to say. Um, there was the spiritual concept of the seventh seal, the seven seals.
Yes.
And in effect, the more you get spin density in your heart, the more you have access to the inside of that vortex tornado. The turning point, by the way, is green, and that is called the Emerald City, if you've ever been to Oz. it's,
Right.
it's
Oh,
literally turning it.
oh,
We could go into all the physics of green, but that's another story.
right.
Uh, but now let's get to your question about time aperture. Um, there are some important things that need to be said because uh, physics has been somewhat confused in calling it a matrix of time space. More accurately, time is merely and only and never more than simply a name for spin rate. That's all it's a name for, nothing else. So, for example, charge rotation stores inertia. We named that mass. So, rotating charge is the only origin and definition of mass. Very simple but important. Secondly, charge rotation creates the illusion of a period of spin, which we named time. So Einstein was profoundly confused when he said if you accelerate, you bend time and space. It's the wrong language. Actually, what would be correct is to say that as you accelerate, the translation of vorticity simply changes the spin rate. So some of the inertia that was being invested in acceleration is accelerating the spin rate. That's why the watch speeds up. So once you understand that you're only naming rate of spin and nothing else, only then can you understand time. So now let's look at time reversal. So, these ETs, our friends, actually Austin is saying, the ETs from the future are bouncing off lasers off the moon. And we now know that would be a phase conjugate mirror, which is the first way time reversal has been defined in physics. And what did they mean by time reversal? Well, actually, the only thing that physics ever meant by time reversal was a return to a previous state of increased order. And we've said many times you can't time reverse uh, good clean steel to rusted steel. You can only time reverse rusted steel to unrusted, which is say you can only time reverse to increased order. So actually, when physics says time reversal, they only mean negentropy, which is the title of my book. Uh, and the reason this charge implosion creates negentropy, which is increased order, self-organization, which is now we know that you should not teach your kids the universe is condemned to entropy, because that's a lie. There is a way out of chaos, and that is charge implosion. And the reason charge implosion, phase conjugation, frontality, creates negentropy, self-organization, is quite simple. That as the waves converge to that implosive center, they're sucked in quite literally, the origin of all centripetal forces, why plasma clouds become angels, and why ball lightning responds to telepathy, is because mind exists at the center. And mind is a place where the waves converge to Planck and created that universal radio, which is why the Planck is the same for 1 billion light years in all directions. Somebody created agreement, and that is the democracy of mind. And so that creates that communications network, which is why everyone on the planet felt it when 3,000 people died in 9/11. That was DNA radio at work. And that is a democracy based on the physics of phase conjugation of Planck. And we know DNA is profoundly fractal golden ratio everywhere you look. So that's the basis on which this mindfulness exists. So back to time and these time loops, you have access to more and more of those spin horizons when you get to that point of perfect compression. Now, in the advanced science, and this will be another conversation on another day, but if you're building a portal to other dimensions or a space portal or a wormhole, all you do is create massive broad spectral phase conjugation here, and you match it perfectly at the other end. And that longitudinal wave propagates, and because the golden ratio harmonics multiple times the speed of light, that infinite harmonic series, you can propagate that and create that action at a distance. And Tesla didn't understand that very well, but that is the key, absolutely, to power transmission at a distance without wires. And we now know that that nodal array for transmission at distance without wires is the fractal grid, which uses harmonics of Planck and turns out to be a dodeca flower on the surface of Earth. The Templars knew it when they built the cathedrals. How come Tesla didn't?
So remembering love then, the negentropy would be when we bend to love, not fear, and how this is useful for the trauma-informed care workers is that the challenge is to help somebody who's so embedded in the trauma to be able to access, that holy grail where the inside is the same as the outside, which is what you've already discussed, but in just using a different language. But how I wanted to address time was how to assist that person who is blinded, we could say, to love because they're so sucked in to fear. Is there a short answer? I don't need a short answer. I'm just saying, is there an answer?
Well, I'm sure there's 100 levels there, but one that occurs to me is recently I had severe fevers and I was down for weeks, and I probably had it actually. And I
Hmm.
was using Therify pretty extensively and vitamin D and all the other usual stuff.
Hmm.
And I found that, with Therify, you sometimes get too much buzz and there's a challenge to keep hydrated and grounded. And I actually noticed there was a turning point one day when, I was buzzing from the Therify and it, it didn't have the right phase relationship to ground. It happens that just behind the house here, there is a fabulous irrigation channel with the ice cold mountain water. It's a miracle here in South France. I gotta say, it's a fabulous gift. So I went out there, and Valerie kind of pushed me and stuck my feet in that cold water, and suddenly it was actually a turning point.
Hmm.
And it had to do with grounding. So there I had the spin, I had the Bliss, I had the Therify, but I didn't have the ground. And that was establishing the phase relationship to that perfect cascade, because all grounding is access to a fractal. We now know that. And so perfect ground is the actual solution here, because that then turns on the information fountain.
Okay, but what about the temperature? Because this technique of stepping into freezing cold water is something that our homeopathic elders practiced when we were first, I guess, learning about medicine. Did temperature have any? I mean, I get the ground for sure.
Well, you see, of course, cold water is clearly far more ordered and
Mm-hmm.
therefore probably more conductive, and that's good. And I think stepping in cold water is good. And there's that they call the derivative bath, where you bathe your loins, and it's very grounding. But of course, if you have access to a real river, or in this case, real mountain water flowing, then the
Mm-hmm.
ground is even better. And I was talking with Myra today. She says, "Yeah, you notice I get this telepathy and this lucid dreaming even better when I'm using water." And I said, "Oh, yes, when you touch the water, and it's receptive to longitudinal waves and all the physics about grounding in water." So these things fit together pretty nicely.
It fits together so well, and we're just bouncing all over the place because I wanted to address each one of these topics, water in particular. Understanding water, we can underscore the importance of every thought and feeling that we choose to engage, and so that brings us right back to the muscles of the heart, for example. But one other thing that I didn't really develop clarity on, but I feel it's appropriate when I'm helping therapists um, resolve their own trauma from being the intermediary for people with trauma. So, for example, I remember one time you said to me, I was explaining to you, Dan, I've really learned that I cannot be the proxy in the Therify for somebody because I pick up all their stuff and then I don't know how to deal with it. And you told me it's because I didn't have the appropriate membrane. Do you mind just kind of helping me understand that a little bit?
I'm sure that's a very deep question. At least at one level, uh, the aura has a self, not self boundary, which is established like a soap bubble.
Mhm.
And people who are highly intuitive and healers, and often women, have a softer aura boundary, which is beautiful but challenging. And so you tend to take on the emotions of everyone you see. A classic example would be after Daniel Brinkley had his second near-death experience with lightning, and he noticed that everyone he touched,
Right.
because his DNA was literally electrically superconductive due to the lightning hit,
Yeah.
he would have a flash of everyone's peak emotions of their whole life just by touching them. And so he was afraid to touch anybody because he'd get flashes
Mhm.
of every peak emotion of their life. And we now know how it
Mhm.
actually electrically how DNA becomes a superconductor when you zap it with high amperage at the moment of crystallization. And the same is true of a thread of gold, by the way. So
Mhm.
here you are, a bit of that superconductor, and set your boundary condition. The boundary condition, there's a lot of ways to talk about this, but would have also to do with grounding. So that actually, if you
Okay.
had access to good ground, where
Mhm.
the bigger the pain you feel, whether it's yours or somebody else, the better you need access to ground, because more of that spin has to go through you to restore fractality. So, and your access to ground, it's more than just barefoot on the mud or in the river.
Mhm.
It's also access to the memory of all spin. So it's everyone.
Mhm.
It's
Mhm.
the Indian chief who said, "Well, I had a conversation with the Creator." What he means by the Creator is, in fact, that DNA radio at the center of all spin. So the more you spend time feeling the center of the collective unconscious, the more you have contact with the center of the tornado, and the bigger the tornadoes of pain that you can steer. So it does relate to grounding as well.
Okay, when we think of DNA in the cell as it, we think of it as being surrounded by water. I mean, that can be a very useful understanding. And since DNA in the cell is surrounded mostly by water, it can be helpful to understand the significance again of how those long waves would shape what would we use metaphorically, like the riverbanks.
Well, I was the one who proved that the hydrogen radii were precisely exponents of Golden ratio times Planck. So I was the first one to prove the fractal structure of hydrogen. And now we know that's not just the center of every water bond, but that's the center of every DNA ladder rung, is that same perfectly fractal hydrogen bond. The thing is, when the DNA, which then is atomically and molecularly fractal, then macromolecularly braids, braid on the braid on the braid of the braid, thread, string, rope, fat rope, with the longer phonon waves of love and coherent emotion. Suddenly, the phase conjugation becomes much more broad spectral, eating the longer waves, as in Ride the Long Wave, Uncle Joe, meaning you can then steer a bigger tornado. And that's the story of DNA, toroidal DNA. The more time you spend in long wave bliss, the bigger the tornadoes you can steer, and the more pain you can refer back to ground.
And I kind of thought we'd wind up somewhere near the astral hygiene discussion, you know, the centripetal life force and biologic rejuvenation and the negentropy that's available to us. However, in the interest of arresting psychological repression of those unpleasant memories that stand in the way of these people who've been so traumatized, you know, and I thought it'd be relevant to look at the unlearning, time in the sense of unlearning the experience. Or, and I mean, to me, that sounds a bit like the heterodyne, the adding and multiplying. And is there a path we can help somebody find the unlearning or the adding of new information to achieve that?
Well, I'm not sure it's precisely on point, but what occurs to me is in the physics of memory, the most destructive thing is a discontinuity of memory. So anything that prevents memory from being continuous, like dissociating from your body at a moment of max pain, sometimes called a psychotic break even. Um, Anything that interrupts the continuity of memory is fundamentally a break in the fractal and seriously a problem. So for most, I mean, this is cliche and well known, that people who have disconnected from a moment of great pain and then created a barrier there have also broken the fractal of their memory and therefore the charge of their soul. So it's well known, it's obvious that you need to go back and find the memory of the moment of maximum pain, relax, breathe deeply into it, and then your body will reassemble its bigger aura. So, it's well known in psychophysics that if there was a moment of great pain and you created dissociation, you got to go back and find that pain and relax and breathe through it. And suddenly your aura is bigger. That's well known. Now we understand the physics because that prevents the long wave of your aura from assembling. So, and we also know the physics of how you move through a moment of great pain that you had chosen to forget, and that is by the science of deep breathing and teaching yourself intense relaxation. You remain conductive in the face of that memory. Relaxation is conductivity, and therefore implode further that break in your memory and reassemble your aura and therefore your soul.
Yeah, and it's unfortunate that many therapists are taught to avoid doing precisely that recreation of the PTSD moment, but
Yeah.
this is in essence would perhaps prefacing or framing it with compassion for yourself, do you think that would add a little bit of coherence? I mean, first of all, you actually have to recognize and know when you're really truly in compassion. But if we could get there, maybe it would make that journey back through the hole, back through the aperture.
Back through the pain, even. Yes. Well, the classic way we learned in graduate school is called relaxation therapy. Is you teach the person, you know, relaxation techniques intensely, which is, by the way, how you teach hypnosis. And as they're doing their deep breathing, and you every day they work on their relaxation. Then, when they're completely relaxed, they get closer and closer to their moment of pain until finally they can be completely relaxed as they gradually approach the painful memory. And if they can finally go right through the painful memory and still remain completely relaxed, then they're conductive and they've reassembled the memory. So the skill of relaxation has much to do with reassembling those memories.
And what about relating gravity to that emotional pain? I don't know if that's accurate, but gravity being that centripetal electrical force, and then the
That's
golden
right.
ratio. Yeah, go ahead.
And it's even why, when we see ghosts, we usually see them at the point where there were great emotions and they created a little bit of
Mhm,
gravity there. Well,
mhm.
actually, gravity is a pretty vague name for centripetal force in general. And the sad part is, as we say, your physics teacher and Einstein, NASA, and Stephen Hawking all failed to teach your child why an object falls to the ground, and therefore cannot teach your child why anything is centripetal, and therefore cannot teach your child the function of mind, or how anything becomes self-organization. And therefore, they think the universe is condemned to entropy, and therefore your child cannot know how a plasma cloud becomes an angel and talks to you. And I just got off the phone with Myra, who said her plants are starting to talk to her, and we understand the physics beautifully, and your physics teacher doesn't.
Yep, that's the truth. Well, phase conjugation, negentropic. What we're saying is that self-organizing has to come about by self-awareness, and this
Right.
is how you achieve that.
Right. And the ability to self-refer, that non-destructive self-reentry, which enabled that charm wave to recur back to that center point implosively and keep touching that implosive Planck harmonic series where the DNA radio transmits, that self-reference is what created that embedding and expanded that aura and made you feel something bigger and bigger and bigger. So mindfulness is that implosive recursion.
AKA bliss.
Exactly. We call it bliss simply because the radiance always follows implosion.
And isn't that what people who are seeking alcohol or drugs
Exactly. Because
are?
because they simply yearn for immortality. They know they're toast if they don't get to the bigger wave. And in fact, the taste of bliss, we're programmed to risk death to get the taste of bliss because we know we're dead without it. So we always say, admire your teenagers for being willing to risk death to have a bliss experience because they're right. And then if
Yes.
you teach them the real access to bliss, then you have culture. Until you can teach your kids how to get real bliss, you do not have culture. Sorry, it's not the color of your wine and your shoe polish. No. Culture is the ability to teach your children how to have a bliss experience because that immortalizes and is the origin of all immune systems.
Well, that really wraps it up so nicely. One of your books describes this. I mean, much of the material that's available through all of your many websites, but I'm thinking the origin of biological negantropy and how beautiful and easily accessible that is for people just to learn about this if they wanted to pursue this a bit on their own.
Well, thank you.
Did
Yeah,
you want, yeah,
we
and go ahead. I was going to mention something about fractal field, or what else do you feel like would
oh,
be
oh, that
most relevant?
no, that's great. So for the intro, that's perfect. Yes. So my book, Origin of Negentropy, the new free PDF, it's available in print as well, but the free PDF, fractalfield.com/online book. And exactly, that's right. We created a new introduction for that book specifically for people who said, well, let's make it simple. Like, what is a fractal lifestyle? It's very great for introduction. Now, for the advanced work, I think the best is the recent lecture on the origin of zero-point energy technologies, my presentation keynote at the Breakthrough Energy Technology Conference this year in Amsterdam. And that is fractalfield.com/vacuum energy. So those two together make a real fun synthesis.
Okay. Yes, and I wanted to mention your water imploder when we were kind of dancing around the whole water topic. Um,
Yes, we've
but
had a breakthrough, if I may say. Just
yeah,
so theimploder.com, our super imploder has been around for 7 years and it's dramatic. You get 30 to 50% growth increase in hemp, marijuana, and all this cool stuff. Hypersolubility, and by the way, use it in a spa and the skin injuries go away, psoriasis, very cool. Well, recently, it's been a dream for years with my partner, Jason, fractalwater.com. And finally, we have launched the professional version called the Ultra Imploder. It's 1 inch, it's all stainless, it's indestructible, and you can put like 500 psi in there, no problem. And I was like worried. Well, we stuck hundreds of thousands into the new version called the Ultra Imploder. It's big, it's heavy, it's a monster. And I thought, oh, well, guess what we found out? The Amish in Ohio, they say everyone we've showed it to wants to buy it immediately because when you taste the water out of that thing, it's incredible. We increase the magnetic strength and the vortex size, and it just so check out the new Ultra Imploder at theimploder.com. The results are off the charts, and people are loving them. So we're having fun with imploding water.
yeah, and isn't that ever just such a simple way for our trauma-informed workers, care workers, to support themselves? How easy, how beautiful,
Well,
and
yes.
how simple. Okay, so the certainty we're looking for is this way of turning trauma into compression. You know, that sorting that you talk about in the Irish bars, the sort charge acceleration, that sorting. So the core wave mechanism of life force, self-awareness itself, is the phase conjugation. That's available through several ways, but through Therify in particular, and through some of your other technologies. What else? Okay, so teaches us bliss. What do you feel like perhaps I might have left out of this as we kind of come to a close here?
Well, if you're talking to a conventional physicist or Einstein, it's very fashionable these days to talk about perfected collapse. So
Mm.
perfecting collapse is used in both psychology and physics, and it's the sexy term. They call it perfected entanglement these days, which we now know is perfected embedding, which phase conjugation is the answer to all those questions. But perfecting collapse is exactly what you do when you seek out to sort the pain from trauma. So suddenly the intention of all the good guys and the bad guys in the picture are suddenly collapsed to one point. And from there you have perspective. So perfecting collapse is a good language as well.
Yeah, I like that. That's like oneness 101.
Exactly. Well said.
Okay. Well, neuroplasticity and epigenetics say we can renew the mind,
Yes.
and you have given us the tools to put it all into living practice, Dan. Therify, Flame and Mind, Plasma Fire. And so we know where we can go to find more of your work. Is there any other that you wanted to mention?
No, no. Well, that's great. So it's Plasma Fire, PHIRE.com. And Shelley has been a pioneer. It's a fabulous way to use plasma very inexpensively. And you can use the perfect implosive sonics, the binaurals in there. And that all works with a new vibrator, the 5vibes.com, which is also much more powerful in therify.net. And you can also see there the new Quantify system, which is modulated with the new implosive sound. And of course, the water technologies, the imploder.com. And the flameandmind.com now has all kinds of new features. Check it out. And at the top there, you'll see the new Seeing Without the Eyes project. So yeah, we have a lot of exciting ways to pursue this. And I thank you, Shelley, for being a pioneer, for sharing so many of these things and helping us test them. Thank you. Blessings, dear.
Yes, and it is such a blessing, and I just, I have so much gratitude for you and for your work. So thank you, Dan, so very much. I'll look forward to the next time you say yes. I'll do that interview with you.
Thank you,
Thank
Shelley.
you. We appreciate your time, your care, your kindness. Thank you so much. Here in the shareable wave.
Thank you. Blessings, dear. Check out the new blog at therify.net, coming soon.
We're gonna do that.
Okay.
Okay. Bye for now, everyone.
Bye.